Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, the things that you're curious about around the city of Mississauga, and we'll explore the story of this place together. So if there's anything that you're curious about, anything that you're wondering what the story might be around the history of this community, please send it in to us, and together we'll have fun exploring the story of this place. Thank you. Thank you, Elaine, for your question on an interesting little building towards the back of Trinity Anglican Church and Cemetery on Ontario Street in Streetsville. The address is 36 Ontario Street for this interesting little building. A lot of people might wonder what this relic from our past might have been. The building itself probably dates to about 1907, 1908. That's a suggestion given to the building. So we're dealing with something that's over 100 years old, and tied to that building, if you visit it as well and take a look, you'll see some remnant hydro poles or highline poles that kind of stretch down into the ravine behind it, and these are intrinsic to the operation of what this building was and how it connects to its story. The building itself, in short answer that you're asking about, this was the transformer station for the Streetsville hydro development that was down in the Credit River, and so the hydro was generated down in the valley and then brought up by transmission line to the transformer building. This is the transformer building, and then it was the hydro was distributed then to the residents of Streetsville. So to go back a little bit in time, this little building that survives today was tied to the hydroelectric plant that was down in the valley behind along the Credit River. The property itself was linked to something that was known as the Ontario Mills, which is where Ontario Street gets its name from. The Ontario Mills, built by John Church Hyde, in the 1840s. Originally, it operated as a multifunction facility with a sawmill and a grist mill, as well as and being later converted to a flax mill. But the old mill itself burned in 1867. My apologies. What was left was the wooden superstructure of the large mill was lost, but the lower stories of stone remained as a ruin, and the dam that once stretched across the Credit River in this location to provide the water power also deteriorated in time. The mill site itself was largely abandoned after its fires in 1867, and interest in the site wasn't revived until 1906, 1907, and this was the site chosen to operate the hydroelectric facility in Streetsville that would come to be. Streetsville has an interesting history with hydroelectricity. The village received its first electricity in 1902 through a long transmission line with the Ball Electric Company, but it had been an issue in Streetsville since 1894 of generating their own electricity. However, it wasn't until 1906 that there was a renewed interest in developing their own under Reeve Thomas Bowie. And so in 1906, a decision was made that Streetsville would develop their own hydroelectric site. And in 1907, they received the go-ahead from the village proper, the residents themselves, and the former Hyde Mill location at the foot of Ontario Street was chosen as the ideal location. And so beginning in 1907 and continuing into 1908, a dam was built across the Credit River, and they converted the old foundations of the Hyde Mill into the new hydroelectric generation plant. And so there was an interesting interplay of history and modern rebuild taking place on a site that was known for its own water power. And again, there was a large dam that was erected across the Credit River to generate electricity. The electrical generating station operated originally on one turbine and then expanded to two turbines to produce a greater amount of electricity and more reliability. If you're on Queen Street today in Streetsville, just outside what was formerly the Maiden Lane School, you will find a turbine on display with a plaque on it commemorating the Streetsville Hydroelectric or Public Utilities Commission that produced the hydroelectricity, and that turbine was taken from the mill. There's a plaque on it that talks about Streetsville's Public Hydro Commission. And so in 1906-07, a dam was built, opening finally in 1908. And Streetsville produced its own power exclusively until 1943, when it joined with Ontario Hydro, and the Streetsville site continued to operate to create auxiliary power up until about 1960. And so there was a phase out of the site over time. It has largely been abandoned to this day. You can still see the ruins of the stonework of the hide mill along the banks of the Credit River. The dam itself, many residents of historic Streetsville remember swimming off the dam, diving into the lake that was created and to upstream of the dam where the head pond was. We have some pictures of that. We'll show some pictures of that over time with this answer. But again, that little transformer building to the rear of Trinity Anglican Church and Cemetery in Streetsville is a remembrance of this time when Streetsville generated its own electricity, something that the village was quite proud of, and its residents championed greatly, particularly when the lights went on for the very first time. It became quite a thing to do when the date was February 3rd of 1908, when electricity was turned on in Streetsville. And again, over 100 years ago now. So just a fascinating element of our history, and this little building has a unique role that it once played for the residents of Streetsville and the generation of hydroelectricity. So thank you for the question. Our next question this week on Ask a Historian is from Sherry, and Sherry was asking about history of an old yellow house on Derry Road near Mavis Road, and particularly a house that is currently boarded up, and every house has a history, and every house has a story to be told, and no different than here with as you say, Sherry, with the old yellow house on Derry Road. The house was built sometime around the 1850s, maybe as early as 1848. We're not entirely sure on the date of construction, but the house was built by a Robert Bell, we believe. And it had a number of owners over time. We do have a history of ownership of this property, but for most of its history, it was associated with a 100-acre farm. Right up until even the 1950s, it was still an operating farm. A later owner of the property was Colonel Reginald Van Every Conover, who was a First World War veteran, a major in the First World War, and later rose to the rank of colonel with Lawrence Scott's militia. He was a teacher by profession, also operated as a school trustee, was very well known in the surrounding community. And so we do have quite a bit of cultural history around past owners of the property. But you're also drawn, I imagine, to the way the house is visual on the landscape today and what you've seen of the house. And so I've invited John Dunlop on with me this week, and John is the manager of Heritage Planning and Indigenous Relations with the City of Mississauga. And John deals with heritage homes as they evolve within the city today around us. So welcome, John, to Ask a Historian, and thank you for joining us, and offer you to take it away on what we refer to as the Bell Conover House, 611 Derry Road West.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much for the invitation. So the Bell House is it's known as what's listed in heritage planning, and what that means is that it's listed on the city's heritage register. In Ontario, there's a piece of legislation known as the Ontario Heritage Act. It was passed in 1975, and it is required, it's required municipalities to keep a register of all the heritage buildings within their jurisdiction. So currently, the City of Mississauga has about 1,500 properties, give or take, on our municipal register, one of which is being the Bell Conover House. The other step that can be taken with heritage properties is that they can be designated. Now, a designated house has greater protections under provincial law, under that same Ontario Heritage Act, and it protects the house from major changes. It protects it from redevelopment and so forth. And it requires that City Council consider anytime an owner wants to make any changes to the house. So the Bell Conover House, as I mentioned, it's just listed. So when a listed house is considered for designation, city staff look at the history, they look at the architecture, they look at how it sits currently. And this particular house, it's fairly prominent along Dairy Road in that it's got a large property surrounding it. It used to be part of the much bigger farm, as you were saying, Matthew, but now that's been diminished as the farm was sold back in the 50s or 60s and was turned into subdivision. So you end up with a lot of these heritage properties that have these very large lots associated with them. Now that Mississauga has sort of fully grown and we're reaching the limits of our municipal boundaries in terms of development, developers are starting to look at a lot of these heritage properties because they have a lot of space which is still developable. And so they're looking at putting some slightly denser development in around that. So with this particular property, if its future is for development, then that's something that the city will then review the property, it will review the house, and it will make a determination in conjunction with a committee of council known as the Heritage Advisory Committee, of which you are a member, that will weigh the options, look at the evidence, and make a decision as to whether or not the house merits designation. And if that step is taken, then that house has to be protected when the rest of the property is developed. And you see that a lot in and around Mississauga. There, a lot of people probably notice that there's isolated old farmhouses and so forth in the parking lots of malls, of strip malls and so forth. And that's the result of those houses having been deemed worthy of designation being protected. Ideally, we would see it reused in some way. So obviously, this house that we're talking about, it's almost 200 years old. Depending on how much has changed within it over the years, it's going to need modern plumbing, it's going to need modern wiring, it's going to need some upgrades. And that's fine, and that's allowable, because the best way to preserve a house is to keep somebody living in that house, is to keep using it as a house. That's what we always strive for, and that's what we always want. They also can be turned into office space as needed, but the ideal is to always have a house stay a house, and that's the best way to keep it occupied.
And always this I'm presuming the person who asked the question, Sherry, obviously has seen the house, probably drives by, maybe lives in the neighborhood. These can become landmarks within the community, and ways in which the community can connect to the story of the place that they live in. And so I always commend those that are done well, that remain visible on the landscape and remain functional elements within the community. What are some of the challenges in terms of retaining the properties? You mentioned the upgrades, if you will. Yeah, a house with 200 years of age and probably has had some significant alterations over time and some challenges therein. But there's opportunity here, is there not? Like you can look at it that way as well.
No, absolutely. And I mean, the biggest opportunity is just the pure fact that the greenest house is the one that's already built. When a house is going to be, when you have an older house on a property that's coming up for redevelopment and that house gets torn down, typically that entire house gets shipped to a landfill. So one of the big drivers that we want to keep a house standing is because it's already built. And so renovating the inside, modernizing it, and so forth produces a lot less waste in terms of stuff having to be shipped to the landfill. Now, there are challenges. Sometimes there's houses that are just in such poor shape structurally that they cannot stand anymore. They may have been victims of a fire. They may just have slowly fallen down over time. I mean, not a lot of houses that were built 200 years ago, they weren't necessarily built to stand forever. And I think one of the, another good example not far from there is the wartime housing in Malton, where those were houses that were built for a specific purpose. They weren't built to last forever. When you contrast that with some of the larger houses seen throughout the rest of the city, especially down along the lakeshore, where you have large mansions that are quite opulent, where they were meant to serve as a landmark. But even a small, modest farmhouse from the 1850s like this one, it is a landmark. It is known. And I know people in that neighborhood, they knew it as the nursery center that it used to be formerly before that shut down. And they know it and they see it as they drive by every day. And it's a remembrance of what Mississauga used to be. It's a remembrance of the fact that a city is never something that stands still, but it's something that evolves over time. And the city is a vibrant city, is one that just keeps growing and changing. But it's crucial that we remember our heritage. It's crucial that we keep remembrances of what used to be, so that it's not entirely forgotten.
I was going to say you're a big challenge in front of you then is managing the change that comes in terms of I guess heritage asset sounds very cold if I say it that way, but the stories of the place and the connections to that story in a physical sense. Change is coming to this property, but hopefully in a sympathetic way as well.
That's actually Heritage Planning's motto, is that we manage the change through development. So that's really our role in the city, is to make sure that when change comes to an area, that we don't just completely obliterate what used to be there and build something new, that we keep what's important, what's a landmark to the locals, what has a history, what has a story, and make sure that that story gets held on to. And that's really the goal.
Right. And none of these things don't generally have set in stone timeframes. Like, this is a resident who's noticed this house. It might be some time before they notice future changes on the property, but these things are in process in a sense. There's a process in which the changes will come, and I guess there's no timeline in mind for this as of yet, I would imagine, but probably
no, there's
determined.
No, there's no timeline, and heritage properties can take years to go through a formalized designation process. That's just the nature of negotiation and ensuring that the research is done properly and ensuring that it is the right thing to do. The flip side is not every single house can be saved for various reasons. Some, as I said before, some of them are just in too poor a shape. And so it's about making sure that we don't unduly force an extreme amount of preservation on a house that maybe just it doesn't merit it. But when you have a house that serves as a landmark, it's a pretty strong indicator that it's something that should be preserved, and that's a conversation and a consideration that we absolutely have to do.
Well, I wish you luck in that realm. I mean, these not specific to this property, but any heritage property that comes before you, there's always the balance between the upkeep that's been done and preserving its life. And I guess at some point in time, there's always a best before date in terms of structures that naturally deteriorate in the elements over time, and we're dealing with a long period of time with some of the buildings, such as this one. But with a vision and with a plan to move forward with it, hopefully there is some resolution to this and other properties as well. And this won't be the only change this property sees in its lifetime. It's already gone through layers of subdivision as well, from its 100-acre origins. And we may not remember some of the many families who lived in this house over time, but the house remains. And in a way, there's a sense that old houses, old structures, place names, etc., they speak to the history of what came before. And hopefully this is another example that we can connect to on this landscape, and as it continues to evolve, and it always will evolve around us. Time does not cease, and buildings continue to have stories around them, and hopefully there's more stories to come. Like I said, the best way for a house to remain is to remain a house, and to gather those stories and to reflect on those. And there are many fine examples around our city of houses that have retained the residential connection to them, and continue to be very significant components of our landscape, and loved components as well. So here's hoping that there's a kind future ahead. But like I said, you can't save everything, and the story's yet to be written on this one. But hopefully, Sherry, for the question that you raised, it's something that you keep your eyes on, and keep wondering about. And if that or any other house intrigues you, or come back to us with more questions, and we can update you as things go along. And it's always fun to kind of explore the history of our community. So with that, John, if I would say, is there any last words?
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Thank you very much, Matthew. And if you have any questions, if there's any questions out there, we'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, John. We'll have you back on, and I appreciate your time and your efforts in this regard. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
All right. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Our next question this week on Ask a Historian is from Carter, and Carter asks, how did the First World War start, and how was Mississauga involved? Thank you for your question, Carter, and it's never a quick and easy question to answer on how a war begins. Most often those reasons are very complex and intertwined, and certainly the First World War is no different. But in brief, it was really a series of alliances between countries and ongoing regional conflicts in Europe that led to the outbreak of hostilities in July and August of 1914. Kind of the tinderbox, the match that lit the tinderbox of the pressures that were increasing in Europe at the time was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28th of 1914, and that really set the dominoes in motion in terms of different nations being drawn into conflict and declarations of war taking place that drew alliances into the fight to protect their interests. Great Britain, England declared war on Germany on August 4th of 1914. At the time of the declaration of war, Canada was but a dominion of the British Empire, and we were automatically at war when Britain declared war. Canada's task in 1914 was to mobilize the war effort at home and to send troops and supplies overseas in support of Great Britain. That was our job. We were the young Dominion. We were to provide manpower and supplies in support of the war effort overseas. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was mobilized in August of 1914, and over the course of the next just over 4 years, some 619,000 Canadian soldiers enlisted. There were 60,661 Canadian casualties in the First World War. Around 1 in 10 Canadian soldiers did not come home. It's estimated that around 700 soldiers from historic Mississauga enlisted, and to date we've identified 96 fallen soldiers. That is 1 in 8 soldiers from historic Mississauga did not return home from the First World War. The First World War lasted for just over 4 very long years, ending only with an armistice on November 11th of 1918. If you wonder when we recognize Remembrance Day on November 11th, that is in connection to the armistice that was signed to end the First World War. There were many battles that made up the First World War, and Canadians served all over Europe and in the Mediterranean and beyond. Soldiers from historic Mississauga served and fell in many of the battles that made up the First World War, and here's only a few in which Mississauga soldiers or individuals from historic Mississauga served and fell during the First World War, and they include Ypres, Festubert, Courcelette, Mount Sorel, the Somme, Vimy, Passchendaele, Cambrai, Amiens, Arras, Canal du Nord, and Mons, amongst many other locations. You can do more reading on the overall history of the First World War. I've only scratched the surface and maybe intrigued you to learn a little bit more about this moment in time in our collective history where elements that shaped the world or shook the world and the First World War is right up there. What was known at the time as the war to end all wars, or the Great War. Of course, it didn't end the wars, but the First World War nonetheless impacted every major nation around the world, and right here at home, Canadians, and particularly, specifically to your question, those that lived in what is now the city of Mississauga, were there, served, and fell alongside many hundreds of thousands of others during the First World War, a moment that defined a nation and a generation of people. We remember their service. We remember those that fell and those that served, and we thank them for their brave service. And it's worth more as you expand and explore your world, Carter, to learn also about these moments in time that shaped a people and shaped a generation. I wish you happy exploring. And if you have other questions, please send them in, because we can explore some of those Mississauga connections to these larger moments in time. Look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for your question. You're asking about the old church and cemetery on 9th Line, just north of Britannia, here in Mississauga. Well, kind of one of the interesting things is this church and cemetery are in their original locations, but the geographic borders have changed. In 2010, these were part of Trafalgar County, or Trafalgar region of Halton and Milton, and with the change of municipal borders, it finds its way into what is now the city of Mississauga. It is now part of the city of Mississauga. It's a fascinating story of the church, and I will give you a disclaimer. I do have some family connections to the graveyard there as well, and so fascinating place to explore, to wander, to learn about history, and kind of one of these quiet rural country churches, which finds itself on the very border of the sixth largest city of Canada today. Many years ago, I was in touch with a volunteer caretaker and for the church and cemetery after the congregation ceased. And the congregation, when it closed, merged with Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Milton. Russell Lee was the caretaker at the time and was able to walk me around the church and the surrounding cemetery, and just the love of the place and the story of the place that resonated through him and his efforts has stuck with me over the years. The church you see today on 9th Line was built in 1882. And it was a rebuilding or an enlarging of an earlier frame structure that had been built around 1853. And so you have a church that you see today whose bones are older than what you see. So again, within the church, part of the structure dates to 1853. We do know that the church was moved back from the road. So originally this church was closer to the road. The front wall of the church today sits on the former rear wall of the foundation. So it gives you an idea of just the distance the church was moved back from the road. And that was done as they widened the adjacent road, what we know as 9th Line today. The history of the church, though, it goes back even further than the 1853 frame church. So in that sense, this is the third church. The surviving church you see today is the third church building on the property. In 1818 and 1819, Irish Catholic immigrants were making homes along the 8th, 9th, and 10th concessions of Trafalgar Township. What we know today is kind of the 9th Line and 10th Line areas of Mississauga. These included many families who came directly from Ireland looking for a new life for themselves in the New World. And they came to dub their community Diamond. Their general store apparently was named California. so it tells you kind of what they're looking to develop here, perhaps a perspective of a better place. But Diamond was the name the community was given. However, the local newspaper referred to it as the Catholic Swamp, land that was notoriously prone to flooding and poor yields. Kind of Catholic settlers pushed to the periphery of both geographically and socially on the landscape. During the fall of 1819, two settlers, Bartholomew O'Connor and Charles O'Hara, walked 40 miles to Dundas, Ontario, to persuade Father O'Reilly to come to their little area of Trafalgar Township to celebrate Mass at the O'Hara log cabin. That did take place, and in the next few years, visits continued on a regular basis until 1823, when the congregation in the community gathered enough of a support to erect a small log church. Land was granted by Daniel Highland, a local settler, and a log church was built on the property you see today. And the first burials took place therein, establishing a consecrated burial ground for the surrounding community. We know that it drew congregation members from as far away as Burlington and Malton, which is also Malton in Mississauga today, but still quite a distance away. So quite a widespread for those that came from different corners of the wilderness to a small church cleared along 9th Line. In the 1820s, the Catholic population in the country experienced a temporary decline. This is just after the church was established into the 1830s, and so on, because of jobs opening up in other avenues, such as the building of the Welland Canal. And it's known that about 25 young men from this community left to go work on the Welland Canal. And so that you have these connections to things that are happening beyond just this church that are influencing kind of the ebbs and flows of life in this community. In 1853, the original log chapel was replaced by a new frame church, and the congregation by then consisted of around 50 families. But before the end of the decade, the railways had been introduced, and new markets had been opened up for job opportunities, and people began to leave. And by the end of the 1880s, the congregation was down to just 9 families. The congregation rebounded slightly with new suburban development in the surrounding areas, including Oakville and Milton, and of course Streetsville and ultimately Mississauga. However, although this did bring in new congregation members and swelled the congregation slightly, it wasn't to last. St. Peter's Roman Catholic Mission Church, as it's known, is the oldest church in the Hamilton Catholic Diocese, but they closed and merged with Holy Rosary Church in the early 2000s, and the congregation ceased. In more recent years, the old church on 9th Line has been leased by other congregations, keeping the building alive with activity. So it is a neat touch point on our and landmark on our community of a bygone era that reflects the trials and challenges of building a new life away from home. You can stroll through the cemetery beside and look at the dates of the stones and the names on there and connect to them to this early community of Diamond, and think of the getting your mail or picking up your groceries at the general store called California, which is no longer, and looking at the names on whether they be the Noonans or the Highlands or the McCarrans, amongst many others that are buried in that cemetery, and reflect on these early years of the community and of this portion of Mississauga, when the surrounding pro-Protestant newspaper at the time referred to it as a Catholic swamp. Those that lived into it referred to it as Diamond, and that's the connection of St. Peter's Roman Catholic Mission Church on 9th Line, just north of Britannia. Again, the church today that you see today, built in 1882 as an enlargement and addition to the 1853 frame church, which replaced the 1823 log chapel. a fascinating part of our history and surviving element of a bygone era. These small country rural churches are a rare find in an urban setting today. So just a neat way in which our history peeks through on our landscape. So for that, Margaret, thank you for the question, and go for a walk in a little cemetery and see what else you can find, and what other curiosities might come to light, and we'll do our best to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thank you for thank you for your question on Ask a Historian, Harjeet, and you're asking about what is happening at the old Memorial Cemetery on Queen Street in Streetsville, and also about the history of the cemetery. And so it's my pleasure to welcome today Denise Mahoney, who is the project manager of cemetery legislation and compliance with the City of Mississauga, and our resident expert on the cemeteries that dot our city. And always fascinating and wonderful to talk to you, Denise, and thank you for joining us. And just wondering if you want to shed some light on Harjeet's question around kind of what's happening now, and I guess what has happened in the past with Streetsville Memorial Cemetery. So I'll let you take it on from there, Denise.
Hello, Matthew, and thank you very much. It's great to join you today. And cemetery talk, one of my favorite questions in the world. When I get a call about cemeteries. Streetsville Memorial Cemetery is one of our oldest cemeteries. It's not the oldest in Mississauga, but it started in 1824 when Timothy Street sold land to the trustees of the Presbyterian Church. So it is quite old. It's had a lot of changes over time. It closed in about 1900. There's about 500 to 1,000 burials there. And when it closed because it was full of everybody else. And the new cemetery across the river opened up, Streetsville Public Cemetery. One of the first burials in that cemetery was Lachlan McLaughlin, and that was in 1824. And he was a young man from Scotland. And there was a logjam in the Credit River, and he volunteered to free the logjam, which he did, and unfortunately he drowned while doing that. So he was the very first burial. But for many years, it was the only cemetery for the Protestant religion, and people came from Brampton and Churchville to be buried there. And as I said, over the years, there's been a lot of history, a lot of stuff going on. In 1967, they had a centennial project in Streetsville, and they decided to clean the cemetery up. So they took a lot of the stones that had fallen down and broken, and they fixed them and they put them in the walls. And you can see the walls today. There's a couple along the back and a couple along the sides. The gateway too was an addition to the cemetery, and it was erected by the Streetsville Historical Society in the City of Mississauga to commemorate the 125th anniversary of the incorporation of the village of Streetsville and the 10th anniversary of the City of Mississauga. So over the years, you can see little things that were added and joined in. It's a great cemetery to see the history of Streetsville. And when you walk through that cemetery, all the, most of the original settlers from Streetsville are in there, like Dr. John Crombie, who was the first doctor in Streetsville. He was also the first president of the Temperance Society. The John Leslie and Esther Leslie, one of the first inhabitants. Log cabin still stands today on Mississauga Road. So you can see it has a vast history to go with it. Some of the changes that are going on today is that a new columbarium will be installed in the cemetery. The columbarium is an above ground structure for cremated remains, and there's construction going on presently to put that. And that columbarium is going to be placed right in the center of the cemetery. And you may not know this, but originally the church was in the center of the cemetery, and the columbarium will be placed in the exact same spot that that church stood. The columbarium will be unique. It will reflect the church that stands next door. When the original church burned down, the same room next door, and the columbarium's in almost the same shape as that church, so it will be a reflection of that. And it also reflects the heritage of the cemetery. One of the unique things too about this columbarium is that it will have an ossuary inside. And an ossuary is a chamber for cremated remains. So that's kind of unique to the area.
One of the things I was fascinating to see last year, Denise, and was the archaeology that identified the location of the original church. And we'll show a picture of the church, of the archival image of the church in the cemetery. Something we don't see today. Of course, the church is gone, but that was a neat process in which to ascertain the location of the original church within the cemetery. I think that was under the direction of John Dunlop at the city, but it's been a fascinating project. Not only the columbarium, but just investigating the history of the cemetery. The cemetery, I think we have the plaque there, and I didn't refresh myself, but I think we have 6 War of 1812 veterans buried therein, and Timothy Street, the namesake of Streetsville, is buried in the cemetery, and he's by the big flag, Harjeet. If you're wandering that cemetery and you wonder about the founding of Streetsville, the Timothy Street, of course, is buried within the cemetery. And you mentioned a few of the families from that are in the cemetery. It's kind of a who's who of early Streetsville in that sense. But what some of the ways in which the cemetery has changed too over time. I'm just trying to picture what it would have looked like prior to the walls. I don't think there's many of us that remember a time when the walls weren't there for the cemetery, but these things are kind of organic, are they not? Like there wasn't really an overarching structure that organized the cemetery historically. This was a community burial ground, right? There were multiple faiths that buried here, and do you know anything about that aspect of kind of the early parts of the cemetery, of how it evolved?
Yeah, the early part of the cemetery, you're absolutely right. So the cemetery is usually laid out in family plots. These are early ones that are from that time period. So families would have bought like 4, 8 graves, 16 grave lots. So they would have all been buried together. And you would have seen that if the stones were placed around the cemetery, you would have seen congregations of the same name. So things like that. So when usually somebody kept a map in the olden days, and they would write down where somebody was buried. Or they would just remember, because the caretaker was usually the same person over time, so he would remember when somebody was buried, and the family would get buried in the family lot. So there was no really set, okay, there's a section, range, and lot number, like how Streetsville Public is laid out, and a lot of cemeteries are laid out today. So it was quite different from what we would see. And I guess when you would have looked at it, say in the early 1800s, you would have saw stones all over the place, and it probably would not have made much sense. When you see the big, tall obelisk stones, they're usually placed in the center of the lots. So the 16 lots are surrounding them, and they're usually placed sideways. So it's not just, you can't tell that, oh, these are lots are right here, so it's all over the place. Right. And you talked a little bit about the archaeology. We have actually done a number of archaeology reports in there. We wanted to see what the boundaries were at one point, where the cemetery began, where the cemetery ended. And that was when we knew where the church was. So our ground penetration radar told us where that footprint of the church was. So that when we had decided that we were going to put a columbarium in there, we went back to do that archaeology so we could document that church.
And that's got to be a fascinating way too. I mean, you get to do. I always chuckle with you, Denise. I say you get to do the cool stuff. You get to see what's under the ground. And the in terms of, you mentioned that there is it's kind of unknown how many people are actually buried in there. But even at the low end of your estimate of 500, I don't think there are stones that mark 500 burials in that cemetery today. So uh, I'm just, all I'm alluding to is when you see the cemetery today, it's a much larger cemetery than it appears, and I don't think there's a knowledge of an entirety of who's buried there. One of the things I wanted to share was for more information, if you're looking, the Halton Peel branch of the Ontario Ancestors, formerly of the Ontario Genealogical Society, they do a cemetery transcription, and so this is all the recorded burials that take place within in the stones that are visible, and so you can kind of see it's just a list of names and dates and that appear on the stones. But that's not complete either, because we have so many that are unmarked. Are those early records? Are there? I assume they're piecemeal. Like we don't have a complete idea of everyone who's buried there. Is that true?
That's true. No, we don't have a complete record of everyone's there. When they gather up the headstones and they put into a wall, they're no longer marking a grave. So
Right.
we have no idea. We've had discussions whether to take the stones out of the wall, leave them in the wall, put them somewhere else. But we have no idea now where they belong. But one of the things that's interesting about this cemetery, when it closed in 1900, some families took them and moved it over to the Streetsville Public Cemetery.
Okay.
So when you see stones that predate Streetsville Public, which opened in 1891, 92. So there's those stones over there. And then some people never had a headstone or a marker, so there's those. And then over time, some get lost. They get damaged, they get removed, or they sink underground.
I was going to say, and also with the multi-faith cemetery, because this was Protestant, so it was the Presbyterians, it was the Methodists, the Anglicans had their own, and the Catholics had their own, but everybody else kind of used this one. So in that sense, you've got multiple origins of records as well, and that complicates things too. I'd imagine, probably each church is conducting their own services, their own burials, and probably just a challenge of determining who got buried and when. And I suppose over the years, curiosities have poked up where you find something that is not recorded, and try to make sense of it. Part of living history, I guess, too. That's the fun part of kind of unravel the mysteries as they appear. It's a beautiful cemetery, and just back to Harjeet's question, if you have a chance to walk through it and pawn the gravestones are a little bit like the cheat sheets of history. You can see the names and the dates, but there's stories there, and there's fascinating ones, and often we start and stop with Timothy Street, but there's lots of others: the Barnharts, the Embletons, the Hydes, all significant contributors to the history of Streetsville, and connected to that cemetery. And one of my favorite stories with that cemetery, just as a segue back to my reference to 1812, we have British militia veterans that are buried in that cemetery, and we have an American militiaman who's buried in that cemetery. So you talk about community members that might have had conversations later in life. I mean, Streetsville was settled after the war, and the fellow from the States who fought on the American side ended up finding his way up to the Streetsville area and lived his life in that community and passed away, and is buried alongside British veterans of the war. And so you have to wonder, what the life of neighbors would have been like. And it just, they're fascinating elements of history. And Denise, you have amazing tales. I could listen to you for hours, talk about different cemetery tales. And I'm hoping we get some more questions on historic cemeteries, because we can wander down this line a couple of times, I think. And but the columbarium looks
I think so, yeah.
When is the columbarium supposed to be finished?
At the end of July, hopefully. That's the scheduled date. I was just going to mention one more thing about the cemetery. We talked about like the stories and the families and what's happened over time. One of the other things with that cemetery is the headstones themselves, the symbolism on the headstones, which you don't see today on the newer headstones. You know, with the fingers pointing to heaven, you know, with all the different headstones. You go through, you can see, you know, a finger pointing up. It means that God is coming to get your soul. So there's all kinds of things that they're so unique, and they were hand carved, most of these stones.
The symbolism is fascinating. I always found the shrouded urns, the like I said, the finger pointing up. I've drawn a blank, but there's so much symbolism in many of these places. It's just fascinating to see. The willow tree motif is probably one of my favorite, the weeping willows, and somebody probably somebody has, but somebody should do a book on cemetery symbolism, because it's a fascinating way to look at society at the time that they're created. So the columbarium itself, how this is going to be open for new internments in the future, near future, I assume. Is that through the City of Mississauga then?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So the city manages and maintains Streetsville Memorial, and also Streetsville Public across the street or across the river. So the columbarium will be for cremated remains, as I said, and the honor is also for cremated remains.
Okay. I do have a chuckle a little bit when we look at our local history, and I always say Streetsville Memorial or Streetsville Pioneer Cemetery has a bit of identity crisis. Some people refer to it as St. Andrew's Presbyterian, which it doesn't belong to St. Andrew's, which is the church next door. Memorial Park Cemetery, Streetsville Memorial Cemetery, Streetsville Pioneer Cemetery. I'm trying to think of Scotch Burying Ground. There's a lot of names for the cemetery over time, and so it's a neat way in which the communities have connected to this place, which remains, and I guess officially known as the Memorial Cemetery, but certainly has a number of names. So if you're reading local history at all, you'll probably find a variable number of names that associate to this place, but they all mean the same place. And again, an early resting place for many of us, or the early residents of Streetsville, and significant in the landscape to this day. It's quite a wonderful tribute, and to the memory of those that came before, but also showing that it's continues to be a viable and connected place in our community with the opening of a new columbarium. And so an old cemetery gets new life. Sorry for the bad pun, but it's so with that, thank you, Harjeet, for your question, and thank you, Denise, for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your passion, and hopefully we'll be able to take a look at historic cemeteries elsewhere in our city down the road as we get these questions from Ask a Historian. So thank you for joining us, Denise, and I look forward to future chats with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for reaching out to us, Julianne, and curious about the church that used to be on the corner of Dixie Road and Dundas Street. There was a historic church here, and for most of us, we probably drive by and just notice a small plaza there today. And when you see the picture of the historic church, you marvel at what was once on that corner. So the church itself was a Catholic church. It was the original St. Patrick's Catholic Church of Dixie. Early Catholic residents in Dixie, before they had a church, they used to have to travel a long distance for their services, regular church services, marriages, baptisms, funerals, etc. And there were several places they would travel as far away away as the Toronto Gore, north of Malton to Wildfield. Other places, the Fifth Line Church at Elmbank, or St. Peter's Roman Catholic Mission Church over on the Ninth Line north of Britannia Road. But it was quite a distance for many of these early parishioners to find their way to their house of faith. It wasn't until 1856 that the community of Dixie, some referred to it as Irish Town or Cork Town at the time, or Sydenham is an early name, but what we know today is the community of Dixie. In 1856, they decided to form their own congregation. They didn't have a house of worship yet, but they established a congregation first of fellow Catholic parishioners in the immediate vicinity. Some of the early ministers for St. Patrick's congregation included Father Patrick Conway, Father John Shea, and Father William Flannery, all of Irish origins. Again, the community developed a nickname called Irish Town for obvious reasons. In 1872, the congregation finally was at a suitable size and had raised enough money that they decided to build their own edifice, their own building. A lot was set aside for them at the southwest corner of what is now Dixie Road and Dundas Street. The church that was erected, a stunningly beautiful red brick Victorian Gothic building with an absolutely landmark steeple, high spire you can see in the historic pictures. And the first opening service was held on Sunday, October 13th of 1872. The church underwent extensive renovations a couple of times in its life. First in 1908, and a special reopening service was held on November 8th of 1908. And these were done under the leadership of Father David Tracy. A lot was severed directly south of the church for a new public school. This was in 1923 for the erection of the new Dixie Public School. That building is still there today, no longer the public school, but the 1923 school building is still kind of towards the south end of that property. Extensive rehabilitation work was undertaken on the old church structure again in 1940 and 41. It was aging and becoming difficult for repairs in terms of a cost burden, as well as difficult to heat and the like. But nonetheless, 1940-41, extensive repairs and restorations done to the old church. A new church. In time, it was decided, the congregation decided they needed a new church, that the old church was no longer serviceable for their needs, and the costs of doing so were becoming increasingly a burden for the congregation. A new church was built at 945 Flagship Drive, just off of Tompkin Road, and it was opened in 1971. The original church, the subject of your inquiry, the Victorian Gothic church that was at the southwest corner of Dixie and Dundas, it was demolished in 1973, and so that church is no longer under landscape. It's now the site now is a commercial plaza. The bell tower, the tower bell from the original church, survives today, and it's you can see it outside on the grounds beside the current or the modern St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church on Flagship Drive. So hopefully that answers your question. There was a church there. It stood on that corner from 1872 until 1973, 101 years young, but unfortunately that is no longer on our landscape today, but we can remember that. But the congregation is going strong, one of the oldest and most established congregations in our community, that of St. Patrick's Catholic Church of Dixie. And so thank you for your inquiry, and hope you enjoy exploring some of the local history in your community. So thank you.